The theater was nearly empty. The late-night showing had only drawn a handful of people, scattered silhouettes in the dim glow of the screen, their faces flickering between light and shadow. The quiet hum of the surround sound filled the air, mixing with the occasional rustle of popcorn bags and the soft creak of leather seats shifting. I sat beside my boyfriend, his arm draped lazily over the armrest between us. He had promised we'd have a night just for us, something intimate, something special. But 20 minutes in, I could already hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, slower, deeper. Asleep. I exhaled, staring at the screen, but I wasn't really watching. The warmth of his body next to me had already faded, his presence reduced to nothing more than dead weight and quiet snores. Disappointed but unsurprised, I shifted in my seat, crossing one leg over the other, resting my elbow against the armrest. That was when I noticed him. A man sitting one seat away. I hadn't paid attention before, but now I felt his presence. He wasn't watching the movie either. Not really. His posture was too relaxed, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. And then, as if sensing me, he turned his head. Our eyes met in the flickering darkness. My pulse jumped slightly. It was just a glance, just an accident. But neither of us looked away immediately. His gaze lingered, slow and deliberate, like he was taking me in. His expression unreadable, neither inviting nor dismissing, just watching. The theater was too quiet, too intimate. A strange, unfamiliar heat crept over me. I swallowed and turned back toward the screen, pretending nothing had happened. But a moment later, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him still watching. I kept my eyes on the screen, pretending to be absorbed in the film. But I wasn't. The story unfolding in front of me was nothing more than shifting lights and sounds, a blur of motion that barely registered. Because all I could think about was him. The man sitting just one seat away. I could still feel his gaze, the weight of it lingering on me even after I had looked away. My breath came a little slower, my fingers tightening against my lap. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing, just a trick of the dim light, of my own restless mind. But then he moved. Not much. Just a small shift in his seat, a slight turn of his head. Enough for me to feel the heat of his presence, the subtle energy that crackled in the space between us. I glanced sideways again, cautiously, as if I could pretend I wasn't really looking. And there he was, still watching. Not in a way that felt intrusive. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable. It was deliberate. Controlled. Like he was waiting. For what, I wasn't sure. I swallowed hard and shifted slightly in my seat, crossing my legs the other way. His eyes flickered down, so brief I almost missed it, but I felt it. A barely there acknowledgement. The warmth in my chest spread lower. I glanced at my boyfriend beside me, his head tilted back against the seat, mouth slightly open as he breathed evenly in his sleep. Oblivious. He had no idea. A slow, forbidden thrill coiled in my stomach, something I didn't want to name. I turned my gaze back to the screen, determined to ignore it, to ignore him. But a moment later, I felt it. A shift in the air. The faintest brush of something against my arm. It was nothing. A whisper of movement. And yet, my breath caught. The space between us had disappeared. Not completely. Just enough to make me wonder if it had been an accident. Or if he had done it on purpose. The touch was fleeting, so light, so careful, that I could have convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. A trick of my imagination. A coincidence. The kind of accidental brush that happens all the time in crowded places. Except we weren't in a crowded place. We were alone in this part of the theater. And now, the space between us, the invisible barrier that had separated our worlds just minutes ago, felt smaller. I stayed perfectly still, my body hyper-aware of every inch of space around me. My breath shallowed, my skin humming with awareness. My boyfriend, still lost in sleep beside me, might as well have been miles away. I should have moved. I should have shifted away, leaned back, put that distance between us again. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. And so did he. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us acknowledged what had just happened. But it had changed something. The air between us was charged now, heavier, filled with something unspoken. I forced my gaze to stay on the screen, willing myself to focus, to ignore the heat simmering just beneath my skin. But my body betrayed me. I shifted in my seat again, slowly, deliberately, and this time, I let my arm rest against his. Barely. Just the lightest contact. Just enough to see if he would move away. He didn't. A slow, deep breath from his side. A quiet tension coiling in the silence. He wasn't ignoring it. He wasn't pretending it hadn't happened. He was waiting. My fingers curled into the fabric of my jeans, my pulse quickening. This was insane. This was reckless. And yet, my body wasn't pulling away. A minute passed. Maybe more. Then. A movement. Small. Subtle. His arm shifted, just slightly. Not enough to push me away. Not enough to close the space completely. But enough to let me know. He was playing along. The warmth from his skin seeped into mine, setting off sparks under my skin. My breathing felt shallower, my heart beating out an unsteady rhythm. This was nothing. It should have been nothing. But it wasn't. It was a choice. A quiet, forbidden agreement. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching. My boyfriend stirred slightly beside me, shifting in his sleep, completely unaware. The moment stretched, long and dangerous. And then, finally, slowly. He moved his fingers. Just barely. Just enough to graze the side of my wrist. A touch so light it sent a shiver racing down my spine. I inhaled sharply, my body tensing. And still. I didn't move away. The theater felt smaller now. The walls, the empty rows, the massive screen flickering in front of me, none of it mattered. The only thing I could feel was the slow, deliberate heat where his fingers had barely brushed mine. A touch so light it could have been a mistake. But it wasn't. I stayed perfectly still, my breath caught somewhere between hesitation and anticipation. My heartbeat drummed against my ribs, too loud, too fast. I was aware of everything now, the way the darkness wrapped around us like a cocoon, the distant hum of the movie playing on screen, the steady rise and fall of my boyfriend's chest beside me as he slept. And, most of all, him. The man sitting just inches away. The one who hadn't moved his hand. The one who was waiting. I should have shifted back. I should have put space between us. But instead, I stayed. And then, slowly, deliberately, I moved my fingers. Just the smallest shift. Just enough to let my skin brush against his again. A barely there graze. A test. A question. And his answer came immediately. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers pressed the faintest bit closer, the warmth of his skin bleeding into mine, sending a slow, steady pulse of heat racing through me. I swallowed hard. It was nothing. A meaningless touch. Except it wasn't. Not in the way my stomach tightened, not in the way my breath hitched, not in the way my entire body felt suddenly, unbearably aware of him. Another shift, this time from him. His fingertips traced along the side of my wrist, slow, unhurried. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't asking for more. He was teasing. I exhaled shakily, my fingers twitching in response. The thrill of it, the silent, forbidden game we were playing, sent a rush of adrenaline through me. A small movement. A quiet agreement. The kind of secret that could only exist in the dark. My boyfriend shifted slightly beside me, and I froze, my pulse spiking in panic. But he didn't wake up. Didn't even stir. I exhaled, my body still tense, still waiting. And then I felt it. His hand, moving closer. Sliding over mine, fingers barely tangling. A touch so simple, so subtle, and yet it sent a sharp, dizzying rush through me. I let my fingers curl slightly, responding, accepting, my breath shaky. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. I could barely see it in the dim light, but I felt it. The air between us was thick now. Charged. And then, just as I thought this was the farthest it would go, he shifted again. His knee brushed against mine. I inhaled sharply. He didn't move away. Neither did I. And I knew, in that moment, this wasn't stopping. Not yet. The moment his knee pressed against mine, something inside me snapped. It was nothing, just another small touch. Another subtle shift in the space between us. But it felt different. More deliberate. More dangerous. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears. The rest of the theater faded into nothingness. The distant hum of dialogue from the screen was just noise now, a meaningless backdrop to the silent, forbidden conversation we were having without a single word. I should have been nervous. I should have been scared. My boyfriend was right there. Asleep. Unaware. But instead of fear, I felt something else. A slow, spreading warmth. A thrill that settled deep in my stomach. The man beside me didn't move away. Neither did I. The flickering light from the screen cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp edges of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He wasn't watching the movie. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was watching me. My fingers twitched against my lap, my body betraying me. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I didn't know why I hadn't ended this the second it started. But I did know one thing. I didn't want it to stop. A quiet moment stretched between us, thick with tension. The space between our bodies was still small, still insignificant, but it felt massive. And then, a shift. His knee pressed a little harder against mine, just for a second, just enough to remind me he was still there. Still waiting. I swallowed, my throat dry. My boyfriend stirred beside me, shifting slightly in his seat, and for a second, my breath stalled in my chest. But he didn't wake up. Didn't even move. And when I let out a slow, shaky breath, I realized something. The thrill of getting caught wasn't scaring me anymore. It was making this worse. More exciting. More intoxicating. I exhaled, my fingers relaxing against my lap. And this time, I moved first. Not much. Just a slow, barely noticeable shift of my knee. Pushing against his. His breath caught. Not loud, not obvious, but I heard it. Felt it. And when he turned his head slightly, just enough that his lips hovered dangerously close to my ear, his voice came out in a whisper, so soft, so quiet, that I almost thought I imagined it. You don't want to stop. A statement. Not a question. My stomach twisted, a fresh wave of heat rolling through me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because he already knew. The words lingered in the air between us, quiet but heavy, sinking into my skin. You don't want to stop. He wasn't asking. He already knew the answer. I swallowed hard, my breath unsteady. The space between us felt impossibly small now. Every part of my body was hyper-aware of him, his presence, his warmth, the way his knee still pressed against mine. I should have denied it. Should have shaken my head, pulled away, forced a breathless laugh and blamed the moment on the darkness, on the illusion of anonymity that the theater provided. But I didn't. I didn't move. Didn't look away. Didn't even try to pretend. Instead, I just sat there, my fingers curling against my lap, my pulse thrumming wildly in my veins. A slow, knowing smirk touched the corner of his lips. And then, he moved again. His hand, so careful, so unhurried, slid onto the armrest between us. His fingers brushed against mine, lighter than a whisper, a question without words. I felt the heat of his skin seeping into mine, his touch so feather-light it sent a shiver racing up my spine. I could have pulled away. I should have. But instead, I moved first. My fingers twitched, then shifted, just enough to let them graze his. A slow inhale from his side, a moment of hesitation, before his fingers moved too, his pinky tracing a barely there line over mine. A test. A challenge. My stomach twisted, a slow, intoxicating pulse of anticipation spreading through me. This was wrong. This was reckless. My boyfriend was right there. And yet, when his fingers laced with mine, slow and deliberate, I let him. The warmth of his hand, the way his thumb brushed idly against my skin, the unspoken understanding that this was a game we were both playing now, it should have scared me. But it didn't. It only made me want more. A fresh wave of heat bloomed in my chest, my breathing uneven, my body betraying me completely. The movie played on, its dialogue meaningless, the rest of the world fading into nothing. This moment, this secret, stolen, forbidden moment, was the only thing that mattered. His grip on my hand tightened slightly. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to remind me he was there. That he wasn't stopping. That neither of us was. And then, he shifted. Not a lot. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough that his lips ghosted against my ear again, the warmth of his breath sending another shiver down my spine. And when he spoke, his voice was lower this time, rougher, like he was holding back something darker, something unspoken. Tell me to stop. A demand. A challenge. An escape. My breath caught, my fingers tightening in his. And still, I didn't say a word. The words hung between us, heavy, waiting. Tell me to stop. It was a way out. A chance to undo this before it went too far. Before it became something that couldn't be erased. But I didn't take it. I sat there, my pulse hammering, my breath unsteady, my fingers still tangled with his. My body was betraying me in every way possible, my lack of protest, the way my knee still pressed against his, the warmth pooling low in my stomach. I should have stopped. I should have pulled away. But instead, I let my grip tighten. Just slightly. Just enough for him to know. A slow exhale left his lips, barely audible over the sound of the movie. His fingers flexed against mine, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle over my skin. And then, he moved closer. Not much. Just enough that I could feel the faintest hint of his breath against my neck. My body tensed in anticipation. He wasn't touching me. Not yet. But the space between us had disappeared completely. I held my breath as his lips hovered near my skin, waiting, teasing, not quite making contact. My chest rose and fell unevenly, my fingers twitching against his. He was testing me. Waiting to see if I would pull away. But I didn't. I stayed perfectly still. And then, finally, his lips brushed against my jaw. It was nothing. Just a whisper of a touch, so light that if not for the way my body reacted, if not for the way my breath stuttered, the way my skin burned beneath his lips, I might have convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. But it had. And it changed everything. I turned my head slightly, barely, but enough to feel the heat radiating off of him, enough to make the moment even more unbearable. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around mine. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, a voice from beside me. My boyfriend shifted in his seat, letting out a quiet sigh in his sleep. My body went rigid, my lungs frozen in my chest. Jason stilled too. Our fingers remained locked together. His knee still pressed against mine. The moment stretched, thick with tension. And then, slowly, carefully, my boyfriend exhaled and settled back into sleep. The danger passed. I let out a shaky breath. Jason stayed silent for a moment longer. Then, I felt it, his smirk against my skin. And in the next breath, he whispered, so quietly that only I could hear. "You're not stopping me." His words settled over me like a weight, heavy, undeniable. "You're not stopping me." Because I wasn't. Because I didn't want to. My breath came shallow, my fingers still locked in his, my entire body frozen in the kind of anticipation that made my skin feel too hot, too sensitive, too alive. My boyfriend was right there, but it didn't matter. The movie, the people scattered in the theater, the risk of everything falling apart, it all felt secondary to the way Jason was looking at me now. Like he knew exactly how far I was willing to go. Like he had already won. The heat of his breath ghosted over my jaw, teasing, testing, waiting for the next move. But he wasn't rushing. He was enjoying this. Enjoying me. A slow shiver ran through me as I felt his lips, just barely, skim along the edge of my jawline. A warning. A dare. I sucked in a breath, my fingers twitching in his grip. My body was screaming at me to do something, to either stop this before it was too late or give in completely. And then Jason shifted closer. His lips didn't touch me, not completely. Not yet. But his nose brushed along my skin, the faintest hint of warmth making my stomach twist into something tight, unbearable. My throat went dry, my breath uneven. My boyfriend moved again. Jason went still. We both did. The silence stretched unbearably, the only sound the distant hum of the film playing on screen, my own heartbeat slamming in my ears. Then the moment passed. My boyfriend exhaled slowly, his body settling deeper into his seat, oblivious. Jason waited another second before I felt it again, his smirk, pressed lightly against my skin. His lips barely brushed beneath my ear, and I had to bite down on my lip to stop the sound that almost escaped. I could make this worse for you. His whisper was nothing more than a breath, a dangerous, wicked promise. My stomach twisted violently. I knew exactly what he meant. And the worst part? I wanted him to. I let out a slow, shaky breath, my grip tightening on his fingers. Jason chuckled softly, his chest vibrating with it, his amusement bleeding into his touch as he let his thumb trace lazy, slow circles over my wrist. Still not stopping me. I swallowed hard, my body betraying every rational thought in my head. And when I finally turned my head, just slightly, just enough that my lips hovered a breath away from his smirk deepened. And I knew. This wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. The space between us had officially disappeared. There was no more hesitation. No more pretending. Jason's breath was warm against my lips, his fingers still tangled with mine, his body so close that I could feel the heat radiating off him. His smirk hadn't faded, but there was something else in his eyes now, something darker, something heavier, something that told me he knew. He knew I wasn't going to stop him. And I knew it, too. My body had already betrayed me in every possible way. The way my fingers had tightened around his, the way I hadn't pulled back when he leaned in, the way my breath had hitched when his lips ghosted over my skin. I should have ended this before it started. But now? Now, I wanted it. Jason's free hand lifted slowly, his knuckles grazing against my thigh, so light, so careful, like he was testing just how far he could push me. I didn't move away. I couldn't. A quiet, satisfied hum vibrated against his chest, barely audible over the hum of the theater speakers. You're shaking. His voice was barely more than a breath, low, teasing, brushing against my lips like a whisper of something forbidden. I clenched my jaw, my fingers twitching, my body betraying me further by leaning into him, just slightly. Jason noticed. Jason always noticed. His smirk deepened, his fingers flexing slightly against my thigh, his breath coming just a little sharper now. I could feel the restraint in him, the way he was holding back, the way he was enjoying making me wait. Another test. Another dare. And I hated how much I liked it. The movie flickered on, forgotten. My boyfriend stirred beside me, shifting slightly in his seat, but not enough to wake. Jason's hand slid just a little higher. I sucked in a sharp breath. His lips barely grazed my ear as he exhaled, slow and warm. One more chance. His fingers tightened just slightly, enough to make my breath hitch, enough to remind me that this, whatever this was still my choice. Tell me to stop. I should have. I should have said something. But instead, my grip on his hand tightened, my body shifting just enough to press into him, just enough to make sure he knew exactly what I wanted. Jason let out a quiet chuckle, low and satisfied. And in the next breath, his lips brushed against mine. A touch so soft, so fleeting, that it wasn't even a kiss. Just a promise. A warning. A beginning. The second Jason pulled away, the air between us felt suffocating. The heat of him still lingered on my skin, the ghost of his lips still tingling against mine. My body was wound so tight, my pulse erratic, my breathing unsteady as I sat there, trying to pretend like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just let my boyfriend's best friend almost kiss me. Like I wasn't still craving more. Jason leaned back in his seat with infuriating ease, like this was just a game to him, like he wasn't affected at all. But I knew better. I felt the way his fingers had tightened around mine. I heard the sharp inhale of his breath when I didn't pull away. I saw the way his chest rose and fell just slightly heavier than before, his lips still curved into that lazy, knowing smirk. He knew what he had done to me. And he wasn't sorry. I clenched my fists in my lap, forcing myself to stare straight ahead, forcing myself to breathe through the wild, dizzying rush of adrenaline coursing through me. The movie was still playing, a blur of flickering images, muffled dialogue, just background noise to the storm raging inside me. I was losing control. And then, a sound. A shift beside me. My boyfriend stirred. I felt it before I even turned my head, the shift in his posture, the way his body tensed as he slowly blinked awake. My stomach dropped. Jason went completely still beside me. My breath caught, panic creeping in as my boyfriend let out a quiet groan, stretching his arms before rubbing the sleep from his eyes. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. This was it. This was the moment everything could come crashing down. I forced my hands to relax, forced my pulse to steady, forced myself to breathe. My boyfriend yawned. Did I fall asleep? My heart slammed against my ribs. Jason remained motionless, his presence like a burning weight beside me, too close, too dangerous. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Yeah, just a little. My voice was steady. Too steady. It wasn't normal. It wasn't me. Did he notice? My boyfriend sighed, stretching his legs. Damn. Guess I missed a lot, huh? I forced out a small laugh. Not really. Jason exhaled beside me, just a quiet sound, but I felt it, deep and knowing. I clenched my fists tighter, nails biting into my palms. My boyfriend turned his head toward me, smiling sleepily, before leaning in and pressing a soft kiss to my temple. I froze. The warmth of his lips barely registered. Because all I could think about was Jason. Sitting right there. Watching. Knowing. And then my boyfriend settled back into his seat, oblivious. He had no idea. No idea how close I had come to ruining everything. No idea that just moments ago, I had been on the edge of something reckless, something dangerous, something I still wasn't sure I wanted to stop. Jason let out a slow breath beside me, his fingers brushing against his knee in a way that almost felt deliberate, like he was resisting the urge to reach for me again. I didn't dare look at him. I couldn't. Because if I did, I knew. I wouldn't be able to hide it. Wouldn't be able to hide the flush creeping up my neck, the way my skin still burned from his touch, the way my lips still tingled from the ghost of his almost kiss. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. I sat there, my entire body stiff, pretending to watch the movie, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. Not even close. The warmth of my boyfriend's kiss on my temple had already faded, but the heat Jason left behind was still there, lingering on my skin, burning through me in ways I couldn't ignore. And I knew he was watching me. I could feel it, the weight of his gaze, the quiet tension between us, the unspoken understanding that we had both crossed a line. The worst part? I didn't regret it. Jason let out a slow breath beside me, almost like he was testing the air, like he was waiting to see if I would turn, if I would meet his gaze. I didn't. I couldn't. Because I knew what would happen if I did. Instead, I shifted in my seat, pressing my knees together, gripping my own hands tightly in my lap. I needed to cool down. I needed to get my pulse under control, to remind myself where I was, who I was sitting next to. But Jason wasn't letting me forget. His presence beside me felt heavier now, deliberate. I couldn't see his expression, but I didn't have to. I felt his smirk, felt the way his body remained so still, except for his fingers tapping lazily against his knee. He was waiting. I clenched my teeth, pressing my lips together, trying to force my breath into something even, something normal. But then, Jason shifted. A small movement. Barely noticeable. But it was enough. His knee brushed against mine again. It wasn't an accident this time. It was slow. Purposeful. Like a reminder. Like a claim. I inhaled sharply, my fingers twitching, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. My pulse spiked, a fresh wave of heat rolling through me. Jason stayed perfectly still, his knee still pressing lightly against mine. He wasn't testing anymore. He was daring me. A choice. I could pull away. I could move, create space, pretend like none of this had ever happened. Or I could stay. I let out a slow, shaky breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. And I stayed. Jason's exhale was barely audible, but I felt it. A satisfied hum deep in his chest. He knew. And then, he moved again. His hand, so slow, so deliberate, drifted down, his fingertips grazing my thigh. Just a whisper of a touch. Barely there. But I felt it everywhere. My stomach clenched, my breath stalling in my chest. I should have stopped him. I should have done something. But instead, I let my legs part, just slightly. Just enough. Jason's fingers curled slightly against my leg, his touch barely pressing down, like he was waiting for me to take it back, to stop him, to give him a reason to let go. I didn't. I sat there, my breath uneven, my boyfriend right beside me, oblivious. And Jason? He smirked. You really aren't stopping me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A realization. A warning. I swallowed hard, my entire body trembling under the weight of my own choices. And then, Jason's fingers tightened. And I let him. The moment his fingers tightened around my thigh, everything else ceased to matter. The movie, the people scattered in the dimly lit theater, the quiet breathing of my boyfriend beside me, it all faded into nothing. The only thing that existed was Jason. His warmth. His touch. The way his fingertips pressed ever so slightly into my skin, waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I should have. I should have bolted from my seat, shaken off the heat crawling up my spine, woken up my boyfriend and told him we needed to go. I should have grabbed his hand, kissed him on the cheek, and pretended that tonight never happened. But it did happen. And the worst part? I didn't regret it. Jason exhaled beside me, a slow, quiet breath, like he knew exactly what was going through my mind. Like he was enjoying the internal battle I was waging with myself. His grip on my thigh didn't move, didn't press harder, didn't demand anything. He was waiting for me. Waiting for my decision. I swallowed hard, my body betraying me yet again as my knees shifted just slightly, my breath hitching when his fingertips brushed higher. A touch so light, so controlled, that it made my skin prickle with anticipation. And then, my boyfriend stirred beside me. I froze. Jason did too. For a single, suffocating moment, the weight of what I was doing crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I was sitting between two choices. Between safety and recklessness. Between loyalty and desire. Between the boy I had loved for so long and the one who had, in the span of a single night, unraveled every piece of restraint I had. My boyfriend let out a quiet sigh, shifting in his seat, his hand blindly reaching for mine. And for the first time that night, I pulled away. Not from Jason. From him. I barely moved, barely breathed, barely let myself process what that meant. But Jason did. His fingers tightened, just for a second, like he knew. Like he had felt the shift in me before I had even accepted it myself. And then, slowly, agonizingly slow, he let go. The loss of his touch sent a sharp, hollow ache through me. My boyfriend's fingers finally found mine, lacing through them lazily as he let out a sleepy chuckle. "Sorry," he murmured, squeezing my hand. "Didn't mean to fall asleep on you." I forced a smile. "It's okay." Jason stayed perfectly still beside me. And I felt it, the way the air between us had changed. This wasn't over. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. Because now, I had a secret. A secret that lived in the stolen moments between movie scenes, in the ghost of Jason's touch on my thigh, in the knowledge that for the first time in my life, I wanted something I shouldn't have. And the worst part? I knew I was going to let him give it to me.